Most people know that Jesus said we're supposed to love others as ourselves, but have you ever stopped to consider what that actually assumes? Because it assumes we already have a healthy relationship with ourselves. In fact, that's the one relationship we never escape. No matter where we go, what we accomplish, who we marry, who we work with, or how many people surround us, we are always with ourselves. And yet, most of us spend very little time really examining the quality of that relationship. Instead, we tend to focus on our relationships with everyone else. Of course, we want to communicate better, right? We want to love better and lead better. We want to be better parents, and serve others as best we can, and build better relationships. But what if the quality of every one of those relationships is being influenced by the one relationship that's always present, the relationship we have with ourselves? That's what we're going to explore in today's episode. So, hello and welcome to Powered by Purpose. I'm Melody Lacey, and I help people clear the distorted perceptions that keep us from being able to see ourselves and others the way Jesus does. Because the struggle is real. Most of us are struggling to some degree to live and relate to others the way he calls us to. And that tension is what's keeping us emotionally reactive and disconnected from how he's called us to live. So, we're going to take a God and others approach to self discovery and personal growth. We're going to unpack the real root cause behind the friction in your life and relationships. We're going to do this by examining how your beliefs shape your perception of reality and looking at the evidence your life is already revealing so you can clearly see what's actually driving your behavior. And then we'll look at how to recalibrate your thinking with God's truth so that you start seeing things more clearly. Because when you understand yourself more clearly, you'll be able to understand others much better as well. And then everything else falls into place. So, whether you're building a business, leading a family, coaching a team, or simply trying to live your life more faithfully, this is how we get closer between our behavior and our intentions so that we can truly honor God and fulfill his unique calling for our lives. Because the reality is, renewed minds require more than just good intentions. So let's get into it. The problem isn't that you don't know yourself. One of the greatest misconceptions in modern personal development is the idea that self awareness simply means thinking about yourself a lot. And spoiler alert, it doesn't. Truthful self awareness requires an accurate interpretation. And most of us have spent years evaluating ourselves through inherited standards and distorted assumptions, which we then look at through emotional experiences and with incomplete information. And so we don't struggle because we don't know ourselves. We struggle because we misinterpret ourselves, which means we're also inevitably misinterpreting others too. So, in order to improve that, we have to understand what it actually means to know ourselves. We're told to look inward for answers, to discover who we are and learn to love ourselves. Yet, despite all of the attention that we devote to self discovery and self love, most of us still struggle with insecurity, comparison, things like anxiety and emotional reactivity. And then we have relational conflicts and chronic dissatisfaction. And why? Why do we still have those things even though we work on ourselves? It's because both of those concepts are often built on a flawed foundation. If we're interpreting ourselves through distorted perceptions, which are those inherited standards with incomplete information, then it doesn't matter how much time we spend thinking about ourselves. We're going to continue to reinforce the same misunderstandings. And we misunderstand love as well. See, the world's definition of love usually centers on things like self esteem, self confidence, self care, self acceptance, self expression, and self fulfillment. And while those things can be healthy, they all share a common focus. You just heard me say it a bunch of times. That common focus is self. So the assumption is that if we spend enough time focusing ourselves, we'll eventually become happier, healthier, and more fulfilled. Yet most people who are self focused are still struggling. And why is that? Because self focus and self love are not the same thing. In fact, they're often opposites. So the more consumed we become with ourselves, the harder it is to genuinely see anyone else the way that God asks us to. Because God's definition of love, including self love, is different than the world's. And First Corinthians lays that out pretty plainly. It's quite a list. Love is actually fairly difficult. It requires us to be patient, kind, not envious, boastful, or proud, not to be self seeking, not easily angered, keeps no records of wrong. And so it's a much more demanding definition than most of us are accustomed to. And it raises an uncomfortable question. Do we relate to ourselves this way? Am I patient with myself? Am I kind to myself? Do I keep a record of my own wrongs? I mean, I know I do. I really try to let that go, but that's a big one for me. Because if I don't consistently relate to myself with patience, kindness, truth, and grace, why would I expect my relationships with other people to look any different? Because this is where it gets interesting. We project our relationship with ourselves onto others. So most people assume that their struggles are with other people and are primarily about those people. But more often, they're revealing something about ourselves. Because if you're impatient with yourself, you tend to be impatient with others. If you're constantly judging yourself, you're going to judge others. And if you keep a record of wrongs, you'll keep records for others as well. So you get the gist. The patterns don't stop with us, they spread outward from within us because our perception flows from the inside out. So how we see ourselves influences how we see everyone else. And this really matters because most people aren't intentionally trying to be critical or defensive or reactive, judgmental or emotionally volatile, right? Most of us have really good intentions. We want to love other people well. We want to communicate clearly and respond with grace. We want to honor God and make wise decisions. And we want to steward our responsibilities faithfully and become the kind of person others can trust and depend on. But those good intentions alone won't dictate our behavior. Our perception does. And when our perception of ourselves becomes distorted, every area of life is affected. We become less effective leaders because we struggle to separate truth from projection. We become less emotionally stable because our reactions are being driven by interpretations we never examined. We become less mentally clear because we're evaluating ourselves against inherited standards that may not reflect reality. We become less relationally effective because we unknowingly project our struggles onto others. And we often feel more distant from God because distorted perceptions affect how we interpret Him as well. The impact extends far beyond self awareness. It affects how we think, it affects how we feel, how we lead, relate to others, and make decisions, how we handle conflict for sure, which directly influences how we communicate. And then that flows into how we steward our influence. And ultimately, it all boils down to how we experience peace. So, the quality of our relationships will never exceed the quality of our self understanding. And this is why so many people feel stuck. They're trying to improve their relationship with others without examining the lens through which they're interpreting themselves. And this is why learning to interpret ourselves is so important. Jesus said that the second commandment is to love others as ourselves. But notice he didn't say more than ourselves. He didn't say instead of ourselves. He said as ourselves. And that means the relationship with ourselves matters. Not because life is supposed to revolve around us. It's because the way we relate to ourselves becomes a template we unconsciously use to relate to others, including Him. And that's where true transformation begins. But the challenge is most of us were never taught how to interpret ourselves accurately. We've been taught to analyze our thoughts and examine our feelings, reflect on our experiences, and even explore our personalities. But very few of us have been taught how to evaluate ourselves through objective evidence rather than inherited assumptions and emotional reactions or cultural expectations. And that's why self awareness often feels elusive. We're trying to understand ourselves using the very lens that's creating the distortion. But when you take a different approach and examine the evidence that your life is already revealing, like your patterns, your true priorities, and you see why you make the decisions that you do and why you react the way you do, that makes an enormous impact on the relationship with yourself and with others because you gain access to a level of clarity that you haven't been able to achieve through introspection alone. So, if you're wondering how to do this, then I have good news for you. There's a free way to get started to look at a different way of examining yourself, and the link is below. Hopefully, you enjoyed this and tune in next week for more insights on this topic.